Evening, everyone. Just have a few things to read before we start. The first is a statement about last week's meeting. A point of clarity arising from the draft minutes from the meeting on the 23rd of January. Tonight's meeting is the second meeting of the Cabinet Parking and Planning Panel considering the local plan proposed alterations. The meetings on the 23rd of January and tonight are two separate meetings. This is not a continuation of the previous meeting. Therefore, the draft minute which has been circulated will be changed to reflect the fact that this meeting is deciding upon a recommendation to make to Cabinet, and the words of part of this will be removed. The final paragraph of the minutes will read: the chairman thanked everyone for the debate and advised that the decision on a recommendation to Cabinet will be taken at the second meeting on the 29th of January 2020. In the meantime, if anyone had any further questions or required additional information, they should engage with Colin Hay and the head of planning. Who is the head of planning? Does that make sense? Good, awesome. Second thing I need to read is Chairman's announcement at the beginning of each meeting, so you should have heard this before. Those present at the meeting should be aware that by law it can be recorded by anyone attending. This means the meeting can be filmed, audio recorded, photographed, or reported electronically by the use of social media. This does not apply to any part of the meeting that is held in private session. Therefore, anyone present should be aware that they could be recorded at any time of this meeting. Any member of the public who does not wish to be filmed should move to an area of the meeting room away from the camera. Anyone recording must cease as soon as the meeting is declared closed. Is it anyone's intention to film or record this meeting? One person. Okay, thank you. Great. We are also webcasting this, and a few people are watching, and a recording will be available online after this meeting too. Agenda item number 1, substitutions. Graham.
3 substitutions tonight. Councillor Rebecca Lass for Stephen Bolton, Councillor Sonny Tusu for Tony Kingsbury, and Councillor Malcolm Cowan for Paul Zukowski.
Thank you. Thank you. And apologies?
There are apologies from the 3 substituted members.
Great. Minutes. Can we confirm as correct the minutes of the meeting held on the 23rd of January? I guess with the exception of the clarification that I read earlier. Thank you. Agenda item number 4, notification or urgent business to be considered under item 8. I believe there are no urgent items. Declaration of interest by members. Do we have any interest to declare? Okay, wonderful. Public question time and petitions. The first person I'd like to invite is this today's, right? Yep. Oliver King, are you here? Yep, there's a button just in the middle. I'm going to press that. Great.
Thank you, Chairman. How do you do? Good evening. Can the Chairman kindly clarify why the Council think that the proposed stepped housing trajectory will be acceptable to the Inspector, despite the fact that the Inspector has clearly advised there is a requirement for 800 units per annum, and that any shortfall in meeting the annual target between 2016 and when the plan is adopted needs to be made up within the first 5 years of the adoption of the plan. Is the Chairman concerned that this approach could delay the adoption of the plan, and as a consequence of the Inspector concluding that the Council's targets and strategy are unrealistic and not effective and therefore unsound.
An assumption that delivery could be significantly higher in early years of the plan period is likely to be unrealistic. Targets will be lower in initial years as constraints on certain sites, such as the need for infrastructure delivery or land availability, will affect lead times. A steep target is consistent with national planning practice guidance, which states a stepped housing requirement may be appropriate where there is to be a significant change in the level of housing required between emerging and previous policies, and or where strategic sites will have a phased delivery or are likely to be delivered later in the planned period. As the stepped approach is consistent with national policy and the planned housing requirement would be met within the planned period, it is not considered that this should be introduced, that we should introduce any delay to the adoption of the plan. Thank you. Next we have Tasneem Abdullah. Thank you.
The village of Swanley Bar has been recommended for insetting, and site SB1 is located to the immediate eastern edge. There is good connectivity to public transport and amenities, such as children's play areas and the footpath network. The promoter has identified a number of development scenarios which range in quantum, but also their prominence. The two smallest options, for 30 and 60 dwellings, are highly discrete and have no discernible ramifications for further coalescence or to change the open nature of the area as viewed from key gateways, including the A1000. The LUC analysis fails to accept that these smaller and more discrete scenarios would result in lesser greenbelt harm, which we think in this context is not realistic. These more modest scenarios cannot be concluded to be any higher than moderate high harm and should therefore be allocated as an option 1 site. The sites released for either of these scenarios would provide up to 60 dwellings, and all of these can be completed within years 1 to 5. This is a highly sustainable site, which has good connectivity and the benefit of existing local services. Can the chairman therefore agree that it would be sensible to allocate SB1 as a highly deliverable site, with the potential to provide strong boundaries which can be made permanent through the extension of footpath routes, that can be offered up for adoption and be highly defensible?
Thank you.
Thank you.
The small settlement of Swanley Bar has not been recommended by officers for insetting within the Greenbelt. All of the 3 site scenarios considered, SB1, SB1A, and SB1B, fall into a high harm parcel in Greenbelt terms. The area covered by these sites is important for protecting separation between settlements and is important for preventing unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas. On this basis, the allocation of any of these site scenarios is not supported. And now we have Jonathan Collins. Jonathan, good evening. Your question is very long. All of the members of the panel have received the question and I think have access to copies of the answers, so please can you summarize? It's going to be a very, very long evening. Do not be the one to upset us.
I'll try my best, Chair. And there has been a little bit of additional information as well since we wrote this question. The question relates to site WCG11, which has been deemed to have been only moderate harm to the Greenbelt. It's a very sustainable location, being against the development boundary of existing houses, in close proximity to Welwyn North train station, the Waterside Academy School, Holden's Park Playground, and Howden Sports and Social Club. Historic England were consulted on the plan, but stated they only had the resources to consider a few sites, and were only looking at maps with a desktop assessment rather than a site visit. The site would have potential to impact the setting of the registered park and garden. Heritage consultants considered this in more detail and did undertake a site visit. I'll skip this bit.
Thank you.
It is clear when standing on the site that it cannot be seen from Chewing Water, as is within a valley and hidden between two lines of mature trees either side of the Hertford Road, even in winter. The nearby Panshanger extension, WCG4, is on an open plateau overlooking surrounding landscape, a topographical feature which makes it suitable for an airfield. Historic England notes that the site is visible from the Grade 2 Star registered park and garden. Despite this, Historic England recommended that careful consideration would need to be given to the scale of buildings and the boundary treatment in this area, together with the siting of houses in relation to the north edge of the airfield's plateau, with views up from the River Mimram Valley. On this basis, it seems inconsistent that a similar approach could not be taken to WCG11, the Doberman Club, where the site is not visible from Chewing Park. Therefore, we have arranged a pre-application site meeting with Christopher Lane of Historic England, who is undertaking a more thorough appraisal, including a site visit yesterday. This will establish whether the site is appropriate for inclusion in the local plan assessment, with a written response due next week. At last week's panel meeting, it was said that the inclusion of Panshanger Airfield and the extension site has the most negatives of all sites in terms of sustainability. In contrast, WGC11 is a sustainable alternative that is only one of a few sites that is only moderate greenbelt harm and is also readily deliverable. Therefore, can the chairman agree that this site should be included in the draft local plan?
Thank you. Both Historic England and the Council's Conservation Advisor considered this site. Both raised concerns. The site lies opposite the Grade 2 listed Tewin Water Registered Park and Garden, which was designed by the English landscape designer Humphrey Repton and dates back to the 18th century. The site forms part of the rural, largely undeveloped buffer between the registered park and garden and the built-up areas of Welwyn Garden City. It is considered that development here would undermine the rural character of the site and the valley and would be detrimental to the setting of the registered park and garden. It is recommended by officers that the site is not allocated. As the site has not been assessed as suitable in the housing and economic land availability assessment, it has not been subject to a sustainability appraisal assessment. Thank you. We now have Andrew Newland. Thank you.
Site Cuff 17 is located to the immediate south of the Ridgeway, which forms a well-established residential road leading out of Cuffley. The Ridgeway is washed over by Greenbelt in the current local plan. The LUC report has identified that the insetting of the Ridgeway would result in moderate high harm to Greenbelt and therefore do not recommend that it should be inset. The proposed scheme at Cuff 17 has been rejected as it would not be contiguous with defined settlement boundary. The developer has identified a number of scheme scenarios, including those which are very modest and visually discrete. The scheme has scored well in relation to all elements of the exception of some views in respect of Greenbelt harm. The LUC report on landscape sensitivity is favourable and identifies lower harm than several sites with draft allocations. We do not agree that it is realistic that the insetting of the existing built form in this location can represent a level of Greenbelt harm that is unacceptable. The Ridgeway should be inset and form part of Cuffley. Once inset, we feel the smaller development scenario of Din Manor is very discreet and should be supported, resulting in limited, if any, additional Greenbelt harm. The site's release for either of the two smaller development scenarios would provide up to 375 dwellings, and all of these can be completed in years 1 to 5. LUC have accepted that the release of the entire site would create limited landscape sensitivity, so the release of a smaller site would be acceptable on that basis and perform more strongly in terms of Greenbelt matters. Can the chairman agree that it would be sensible to allocate Cuff 17 as a highly deliverable site, with the potential to provide strong boundaries which can be made permanent through the extension of footpath routes that can be offered up for adoption and be highly defensible?
Thank you.
Thank you.
The site does not adjoin an existing urban boundary, and development in this location, which lies some considerable distance from the services and facilities which are located within the village centre of Cuffley, would not direct growth to the most sustainable locations within the borough. Accordingly, site Cuff 17 failed stage 1 of the housing and economic land availability assessment and is not considered or recommended for allocation. Next, we have Mark Aylward.
Thank you, Chair. Site Well 16 is located to the immediate southwestern edge of Welling, close to the primary school and other village amenities. The scheme has been promoted for a considerable period, and the highways have agreed that the proposed scheme with improvements to School Lane will be acceptable and deliverable. The scheme for 95 homes has scored well in relation to all sustainability elements, better in fact than any other site in Welling. The site was originally larger and has been reduced in scale, removing all the elements that were more open and distant from the village centre. But we can introduce a new footpath link to improve route choices and provide a defensible boundary. Importantly, in the LUC report from August 2018, the site was identified as a moderate high harm with a draft allocation parcel. For some reason, in the addendum report, the Well 16 parcel was repackaged alongside the much more open Well 14 and then found to be high harm. This made the LUC analysis much less granular, the opposite of what the inspector had clearly requested. The original LUC analysis was pitched at the right level of granularity and concluded moderate high harm, and it should thus be identified as an option 1 site in accord with the Council's methodology. In contrast, the proposed draft allocations now include sites north of Welling, which are all moderate high in terms of greenbelt harm, and are constrained by major technical issues with no evidence supplied in terms of deliverability of highway works. We recall that at the last panel meeting, Councillor Kasumi read out a statement which admitted that no evidence studies have been carried out. These require the construction of a new bridge over Singler's Marsh, which is designated as a local nature reserve by Natural England and local wildlife site by the County Council to provide protection from development. The introduction of the bridge and access junction will damage this fragile chalk stream habitat and change the character of the historic common land. We would also note that even if the new bridge can be delivered, the walking route from these new sites to the primary school is substantial and involves crossing numerous junctions. It is not really a sustainable walking route to a school. So, can the Chairman agree that it would be more sensible to allocate Well 16 as a highly deliverable, sustainable and achievable site for homes in Welling, which would better retain the village character whilst providing much needed housing for local people? And we would request that the Chairman can point to evidence showing that the infrastructure works needed for the sites to the north of Welling is genuinely deliverable and would be acceptable in planning policy terms. Thank you.
Thank you. At the request of the inspector, a review was undertaken of the consistency of the parcel assessment in the Greenbelt Stage 3 study. This has resulted in Well 16 now falling within an area of high harm. Officers' preferred strategy does not propose allocating any new high harm sites. Technical work has been carried out to demonstrate the widening of the Singler's Marsh Bridge widening of the Singler's Marsh Bridge is deliverable. The Housing and Economic Land Availability Assessment and the Site Selection Background Paper provide summaries of the evidence. And thank you. And the last person we have is Judith Watson. Thank you. Good evening, Judith. Are you a resident? Yes, you are. Always good to have residents asking questions. Good.
Am I on?
Yep.
No, you're not.
No.
Press the button.
Okay, I could hear you. Sorry.
On.
Good.
I've been following these proposals with interest, whilst at the same time rereading my father's presidential address to the Institution of Municipal Engineers in 1964, 66 years ago, and still totally relevant, in which he refers to the Southeast Study, published in 1963 by the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, and the largest single piece of social planning ever attempted by a democratic country. 2 points in particular are relevant to the position we find ourselves in today. We may find that Parliament itself will be producing schemes for quasi-nationalised control of local authorities. And it is dangerous, especially in the field of engineering and planning, to regard towns or even regions as isolated entities. And another thing, my village of Woolmer Green does not have a ward councillor living in the village, nor is there one of our ward councillors on the Planning and Parking Committee. When I came to live here, there was an embargo on further building fronting onto the B197 because of the increase in traffic that would be caused. Now Herts Highway sees no problems. I would like to ask how many of the panel have actually travelled down the B197 from Woolmer Green to the A1M around 8 to 8:30 in the morning. Yesterday morning, it took me 1 hour. Has anyone on the panel estimated the increase in congestion as a result of the proposed new housing in Woolmer Green? About 1/10 the size of Welwyn, but with approximately the same number of planned houses. I would like an answer. And perhaps the panel are not aware that the market for houses in Woolmer Green is exceptionally weak. Is there really the necessity for increased housing growth in a toroid or donut, which mainly means the green belt around Welwyn Garden City due to its protected status? I am still very worried about the planned erosion of our countryside, and I hope the answers to my questions will be communicated to Mr. Middleton. Thank you.
Thank you. Transport modelling has been carried out to consider the cumulative impacts of growth arising from different combinations of sites and the impact on congestion. The 2012 National Planning Policy Framework states that development should only be prevented or refused on transport grounds where the residual cumulative impacts are severe. The 2019 version of the National Planning Policy Framework amends this part of the framework to include references to there being an unacceptable impact on highway safety. The transport modelling carried out to date would not support such a conclusion. As the inspector has already commented, this is a very high bar. The extent to which land should be released from the Greenbelt is being debated tonight and will be considered at the examination. The inspector has already stated that exceptional circumstances exist for its release. Thank you. We now have two councillors who do not sit on CPPP who have requested to speak. The first is Councillor Steve Markovich.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Judith, for your comments. I may not live in Woolmer Green, but 2 Saturdays ago, I was trapped in my home because of a fatal accident on the A1M. What we really have to bear in mind is that not only are we looking at 300 plus houses in Woolmer Green, but we're also looking at 750 houses in Nebworth, which is a few miles up the road. The capacity of the 197 to take this traffic is severely in doubt. No matter what highways say, I cannot believe that they have taken into account the joint impact of these two planning proposals on this particular part of the road. I recognise that members of this committee tonight have got to make a very difficult decision. Unfortunately, being a councillor is not all about attending fetes and judging bonny baby competitions. Sometimes you've got to take hard decisions. And one of the things that we experienced in Woolmer Green was the impact of having no plan in force. We lost an appeal at the Entex site and have now got 70 new homes forced upon us on a planning appeal because this borough could not demonstrate a 5-year housing supply. The only additional defence we have at the moment is that we have a plan in a real state of maturity and it's got a timetable for delivery. If you members do not propose a plan to the Cabinet tonight, that could be thrown out and the whole of Welwyn Hatfield could be subject to planning chaos and planning decisions made by independent inspectors who have no involvement with the community and no care for community cohesion. The parish at Woolmer Green are also very concerned that the absolute numbers that are proposed could have a serious impact on community cohesion. It's a doubling of the village. This will have a huge impact, and unfortunately the one site at the back of Leicesters is particularly attractive and could be developed quite soon. So this could mean a lot of people coming in a very short space of time. The people of Woolmer Green are quite a tight-knit community and work well together. It would be very difficult if they are imposed, huge numbers are imposed upon them. WRG3 is clearly on the border of Nebworth and is not making due consideration of spatial division and the coalescence of villages. I would say to members of this committee, please, last week you all praised the work that officers have done for you. Tonight, use the opportunity to finesse the plan, to get it to more acceptable. Try and remove this particular site in Woolmer Green. I think it's clear case of coalescence. There are other clear cases of coalescence. Use tonight to finesse the plan, to get our local input. But please don't abandon us to a planning free-for-all. The other concern that we've got, doctors' surgeries. At the moment in Welwyn, the surgery is overloaded. The houses proposed in Welwyn and then at Woolmer Green, you cannot force doctors to come into the area. It is a real concern that people have. With the 197, air quality is going to be a real concern in an urban environment, a village that we should be enjoying countryside, not fearful to go outside our doors. So please, I ask the committee, I know you've got difficult decisions, and I'm sorry that the burden is placed upon you, but please, please do not abandon the people of Welwyn Hatfield to a position where we do not have a plan in force. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Next, we have Councillor Duncan Bell.
Thank you, Chairman. I listened with interest to last week's debate, and I thought the discussion was constructive and some good points were made. Following that, some amendments have been made, taking account of the points raised at the meeting, and I understand that an option is being tabled tonight to reflect this. We're all in a very difficult position, of course. I accept the point about the need for balance between the demand imposed by government-imposed housing targets on the one hand and the need to protect the green belt on the other. But in this equation, we also need to recognise the very real need for additional housing in the borough, which, that people want houses. I must admit that I'm not a great fan of the legislation involved. It appears to put responsibility upon councillors like ourselves, whilst leaving authority with the government-appointed examiner. Such a separation of responsibility and authority within complex projects invariably results in paralysis, and I feel we are seeing this across many planning authorities who are having difficulties with their own local plans. But we have to look beyond this. Blaming the government won't get houses built. Furthermore, the risk of having our planning powers removed or overridden if we are found to have an unsound plan or no plan or a lack of a 5-year land supply is very real and very worrying. Clearly we can't please everybody. Indeed, my own ward, in terms of strategic sites, is taking a heavy burden. But I believe the strategic sites are necessary and important if we're serious about meeting our housing need and providing the necessary required infrastructure. So I'd echo my colleague's point. I think we need to come to a decision tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. And we did have a third councillor request to speak, which of course is Malcolm, but Malcolm is subbing for Paul Sikowski, so I'm sure he will speak at some point. So agenda item number 7, local plan. Colin, can you give us an update on where we are?
Thank you. Can we have the presentation on the screen, please? Right, thank you very much, councillors. What I thought I'd do first is very quickly update on what we debated last week, what we presented to you. So as you know, we have a submitted plan for 12,000 homes. The inspector is concerned it doesn't meet our objective need. That objective need is 16,000 homes over a 20-year period, 2016 to 2036. As a result of the ongoing examination, we carried out a Greenbelt study, stage 3. We also did a call for sites and received 144 new and re-promoted sites. They went out for consultation and we received over 10,000 representations, of which 87% were generally objecting to sites. And as a consequence of that, we have done a site selection process involving a housing and economic land assessment, and then the preparation of a site selection background paper, which all form part of the reports for tonight. We also did a sustainability appraisal of those individual and cumulative options. That resulted in a preferred strategy that we recommended to you. And as we presented last week, that virtually achieves the objective assessment of need, just 48 units under. A good balance between housing and employment land. It selects the lowest harm greenbelt sites, and it doesn't select more sites than necessary. And as you can see there, that just explains the elements within that preferred strategy. And there also you can see the elements, a combination of completions in the last 3 years, commitments via planning permissions, windfall assumptions for the future, the sites in the existing submitted plan plus some modifications, and then a package of new sites that we presented to you. Now, very quickly, just to summarise briefly the debate on Thursday of last week, we were asked to look at site PB1 to the east of Potters Bar and site NOR1 just outside of Potters Bar. There are also comments about the combination of Simonside and its impacts on local road network. There was a suggestion to remove PEA 106 from Welwyn Garden City in order to protect employment land there. There was a request to look at site STL5 instead of STL13 in Lemsford. There was a suggestion that we keep Lensford and Stanborough in the Greenbelt. There was concern about extra housing at Panzanger, both the site we've already proposed for 75 homes and the possibility of an extra 90 to be spread across the whole north and south site. There was concern about the possibility of extra housing at the Week Quarter, which I acknowledged was in its very earliest days. There was the suggestion of an option to keep moderate sites, Greenbelt sites in the plan, but to remove moderate, high and high category sites. There was conversation about stronger climate change policies, and there was the observation that there needs to be a balance between housing need and greenbelt harm, and that 16,000 homes could cause irreparable harm to the borough. Now, just in terms of BP1 and NOR1, an explanation of where we got to with our investigation. BP1 didn't pass stage 2 of the HELA site selection process. It was promoted to us for a very large area, but then subsequently re-promoted with a potential developed area of about 13 hectares with capacity for 160 to 200 homes on that land, plus land given over for mitigation as a consequence. Many parts of that site are local wildlife sites where we've not generally favoured development, and when we consulted Herts Highways, they were unable to find a satisfactory access solution at that time. There is the scope for that site to be added into the consultation and further work to take place with the County Council to look at that access solution and see whether it's available. So I'll leave that for you to debate. In terms of Nor 1, also known as Chas Stora site, that failed the stage 1 of the HELA process because it doesn't adjoin a settlement. There wasn't a great deal of work on capacity of that site. There are also lots of objections. There may be some scope to include it either in a windfall assumption if you believe sites like that might come forward over the plan period and you don't think we've done enough to assume those sites, or in theory there is the scope to allocate it, but you'd then be selecting a site beyond an existing boundary with the consequences there. So I will leave you to contemplate those two. That was me for now.
Thank you, Colin. Questions, comments by members? The microphone and buttons are working today, just like in full council. Malcolm?
Just a very simple process question. Are the Cabinet going to take whatever we come up with tonight, or are they going to say, this isn't what we want, we'll go back to something else? Because if that's the case, we may be rather wasting our time here.
Okay, so just to be clear on, I guess, what happens after today, if we are able to agree as a panel, or a majority vote on a particular plan, that plan will then go to Cabinet tomorrow, and of course it is then no longer within our gift to determine exactly what Cabinet do next. Of course, the objective is for us to have a plan that goes to Cabinet, for them to put forward a plan for consultation, and then the rest of the process will go as many of you already have read and know. I'm not sure if there's anything else I can say, because of course I'm not in the Cabinet, so I can't speak for them. I'm not sure if we can prejudge what happens beyond getting through this particular stage today. Of course, Malcolm, if that was something you were extremely interested in, you probably should have spoken to a member of the Cabinet before you arrived today.
I was hoping everyone would hear the answer.
Yeah, well, we would have trusted you to tell us what you heard. But anyway, the question wasn't asked. We cannot answer that question. We must focus on the job we have at hand today. But thank you for asking. Sonny.
Thank you, Your Worship. I recall at the last meeting, Councillor Cowan said we have spent a lot of time doing this. We have spent a lot of money. My personal feeling is we need to give something to Cabinet, because it's very well we could actually say, we can't come to a decision. We throw it back to Cabinet and we have nothing. We come to some agreement. I'm sure we can. I'm pretty sure we can. I've taken on board everything that previous councillor said at last week's meeting. I've taken account of a number of representations from residents and a couple of developers. I think we should be adult enough to come to a decision. Now, would that decision get a unanimous vote? Extremely unlikely. But we can come to something, and we need to come to something. Otherwise, as he says, this is just going to go round and round and round. And I fear that we may be sitting again here in a year, 2 years, 3 years' time, debating the same thing all over again. And Councillor Zuzowski actually said something very interesting. It is a matter of risk. We're talking about risk. Some of us are happy with high risk, throw it back to the inspector, hoping he will then throw it to county and we can fight it that way. That's just another delaying tactic. Or we can live with a certain risk that we may not meet the numbers he wants, but we can be close enough. And I leave that, that's all I'm going to say about it. And I am willing, and as you know, I can be a bit argumentative, but I am genuinely willing to have this discussion here in front of these people to come to a decision. And we know any decision we come to, not everyone's going to be happy, but that's just the nature of it. Let's give it back to Cabinet. Let's do the job of the CPPP, come to a decision, and then there'll be a consultation, another consultation. So this isn't even a decision. This is a decision to propose something for another consultation. Let's get something done. Let's move things forward. I'm sure we can do it.
Thank you, Sonny. Rebecca.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from last week's debate and in response to the officer report, I'd like to introduce a proposal that has been devised by Conservative councillors. We recognise the challenge of attempting to identify sufficient sites to meet objectively assessed need of 16,000 homes by 2036. We also recognise the scope to select a lower target where there are sound planning reasons and that can be justified to the inspector. We've also taken into account the significant local opposition to growth and its impact on the character of towns and villages and the harm to our greenbelt and the capacity of our roads, schools and surgeries to cope with an increased population. We therefore put forward a proposal that seeks to avoid excessive harm to the greenbelt, reduces the risks of coalescence between villages and does not build in washed over villages. The new proposed plan achieves a total of about 14,206 homes over the plan period and is the substantial addition of around 2,206 homes from the previously submitted plan. And I'd now like to ask Colin to present the details of this plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Colin.
Right, as is obvious, I have been speaking to councillors on the basis of what they would like to propose in response to our officer report presented last week and the debate that took place. As you can see, that is the totality of their proposal. What I will do is talk through what it means in the first instance, and then I will run through the maps to show you on screen what it means for each settlement, as I did last week with the officer's proposal. So, these are views provided to me by the Conservative Party. The submitted plan has already selected what were considered at that time to be the most sustainable urban and greenbelt sites. As a principle, Conservative councillors think that we should continue to favour those sites unless there is valid new evidence that should change our judgment on those sites. To their mind, the Stage 3 Greenbelt study is valid new evidence, as it finds that a number of submitted sites are high harm. They feel this is an unacceptable level of harm to the Greenbelt and that those sites should therefore be removed. This results in the removal of HS22 to the west of Brookmans Park, HS25 to the west of Little Heath, and HS29 and HS30 to the south of Cuffley. Conservative councillors are also worried about sites that are in the moderate high harm category. They don't think that it is appropriate to remove any submitted sites that are moderate high harm, as this would result in too much change to the submitted plan. This means that HS15 in Woolmer Green, 3 selected sites in Welwyn, Birchall Garden Suburb, HS22 to the south of Welwyn Garden City, HAT1, HAT15 Simonside, HS11 to the south of Hatfield, SDS7 at Marshmoor Business Park, HS24 in Little Heath and HS28 in Cuffley remain in the plan. They do think it is right, however, not to select any new moderate high harm sites. This has the consequence of removing homes from new sites proposed by officers, including in Welwyn Green, Brookmans Park and Cuffley. The two exceptions to this principle are WGC4A and HAT1. In respect of WGC4A, Panzanger, which is a moderate high harm site, Conservative councillors think that it is right to observe the inspector's thought that land to the north is not suitable for a new grass runway and should deliver as much housing as reasonably possible. They therefore favour a total of 815 homes across the whole north and south site, so 650 with outline permission, 75 as proposed by officers, and a further 90 as presented by officers at the meeting last week. The allocation should, however, emphasise the importance of lower densities and open space to the north. In respect of HAT1 to the northwest of Hatfield, which is a moderate, high and high harm site, they regard the opportunity for a comprehensive development, including new primary and secondary schools, shops, community facilities, open spaces and public transport improvements to outweigh the high harm to the Greenbelt in the northern part. They also note that the school playing fields would stay in the Greenbelt and create separation from Stanborough. Conservative councillors are also very concerned about sites that cause coalescence between existing settlements, particularly between some of the characterful villages. They recognise that some of these sites would be removed by virtue of not selecting any new moderate high harm sites, but they also believe it is right to remove moderate high harm sites that have the potential to cause coalescence. This results in the removal of WGR3 in Nebworth, WEG12 to the north of Welham Green, and WEG6 to the south of Welham Green. As a result of all of the above, there would be no need to select WEG17 to the west of Welham Green for a new primary school. That is a high harm site, and for sufficient provision could instead be achieved by expanding Brookmans Park Primary School by half a form of entry. Conservative councillors are also concerned about development in small washed-over villages with very few services, notably Lemsford and Stanborough, and therefore propose to remove those sites from the villages. This would result in the removal of STL13, STL1, STL15 and STL17. Councillors recognise that the council has agreed a sports strategy which proposes that a master plan be prepared for Gosling Sports Park in order to consider the future of sporting provision and the opportunity for new homes. They therefore propose the capacity of this site be reduced from 250 in the submitted plan to 100 homes until the master plan has been prepared and a more informed target has been identified. They don't want to make any increased assumptions for the Wheat Quarter site at the moment, but recognise that it might be possible to select a higher target after the public consultation period if pre-application discussions have identified an acceptable scheme. They would like to reconsult on the opportunity for about 160 homes at PB1 to the east of Potters Bar by asking officers to work with Herts Highways to explore access solutions that continue to protect the local wildlife sites. This is because the site adjoins a sustainable town with higher order services. And as stated, and as you can see on the screen, that results in a target of 14,206 homes. What I will now do is run through the maps to show you what that looks like for each settlement, as I appreciate just reading out letters and numbers isn't easy. So what we now show is sites that continue to be selected that are in the submitted plan in purple with a yellow circle around them. Those that are removed or proposed for removal now have a cross through them. Those sites that were promoted but didn't make it into our recommendations are just in red. Those sites selected are in red with a circle, and those sites now rejected are red with a cross. So as stated for Woolmer Green, that would result in the loss of the site at Nebworth, but the continuation of the HS15 site already in the local plan. It would result in the continuation of these two sites in Oaklands and Mardley Heath. It would result in the continuation of the 3 sites in Welwyn already in the plan, but the removal of the 4 sites we proposed last week. Nothing at Digswell. It would result in the removal of the Lemsford site. It would result in the continued identification of Panzanger, the continued identification of Creswick and Birchill Garden suburb, and the preparation of a master plan for the Gosling site, with that number reducing to 100 for the time being. It would result in the removal of all the Stanborough sites. no change in Essendon. It would continue to recognise Hatfield site, Hat1 and HS11. It would make a number of changes in Welham Green, as you can see, particularly the two sites to the south of Welham Green and the site to the north of Welham Green, and the deletion of the primary school site as it would no longer be needed. It would result in the deletion of HS22, BRP12 to the north and BRP34 out to the east, but the continued inclusion of BRP1, BRP35 to the north, Bell Bar. No change in Swanley Bar. Result in the removal of HS25 at Little Heath, but the continued inclusion of LHE5 and HS24 to the north of the village. It would result in the inclusion of PB1 for about 160 homes. No change in Northaw, no change in Newgate Street, and it would result in the removal of HS29 and HS30 on the north side of the road leading out of Cuffley, the continuing of HS28, but the removal of Cuff 15 to the south of that site. The continuation of Simonside, but the removal of Barbourville. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Glenn.
Thank you, Chair. Had my mic on to comment on what we had before that proposal, so I'm just sort of digesting what's come before us. On the going back to pre-proposal, Chair, I was going to say that one thing that didn't come out was I had a huge question on the Pansanger site, and I had that point clarified during the week that indeed we can make a recommendation for consultation, and then it would have to come back, and then it'd be down to full council to eventually take it through, as I understand it. So just so everyone that was here last week that I had that big problem, that's clarified. Yeah, okay, so back to this plan. So this is like going back, right back, rolling back the carpet, looking at that to where we were some years ago, where the towns are taking the brunt of the houses, and the villages are coming back down again, which is our very argument. Because that was an argument for us 8 years ago, that the villages needed to take more on. I can see you have reasons. I can see there's reasons behind it, but at the end of the day, people in these villages do want to have some expansion going on. Some of the sites I can agree with. I can see there's legitimate reasons, but I think somewhere along the line, maybe shrinking of sites and allowing some parts to grow in a smaller capacity might have been a better way to go about it. However, it's a proposal. I noticed you mentioned coalescence for a few of the sites, yet the coalescence from Hat1 into Welwyn Garden City is the closest we've got. That's the two major towns on top of each other. Indeed, like I think it was mentioned last week, a child will be able to kick a football from Hatfield into Welwyn Garden City's back garden. That's how close it's going to be. It's much more coalescence than what any of the villages are going to have. When it comes to Pansanger Airfield, I'm against it. It was, when we put it into the 2016 plan, there was a firm commitment from this panel and then by the council to keep an area set aside, regardless, for an airfield. Whether or not it's good, the airfield, green space airfield, that was 100% a firm commitment from this council. If we hadn't have had that firm commitment, the Pansanger Airfield probably may well have never made it into the plan at all. Also, I've noticed Simonside's still in there. I'm firmly against Simonside. It is the most unsustainable greenbelt site we have. The traffic that's going to end up on Cooper's Green Lane, it's going to be worse than any other part of the town. And I take the lady's point earlier on about driving on the B197. Yeah, I've driven on that, and I know that's a nightmare. But when you add in Hat 1 and Simons Hyde onto Cooper's Green Lane, that's going to far surpass the traffic that you're going to get down there. To say that a bus going through the development is, it's just not the way forward. Simons Hyde is not a sustainable site. It should not be in. It is a standalone Greenbelt site. All of the other Greenbelt sites are extensions. That just cannot happen. That has to come out. And to not dwell on for too much longer, I've just got some points, maybe for the panel and for the wider public at large, just to reflect perhaps on where we are. This meeting and all of the meetings that have taken place on this subject for well over 10 years give the impression that this is a choice and this is our choice. The local plan made up by local councillors representing local people. So much better than the previous system, which William Hatfield's local MP campaigned on alongside our local paper to get rid of. I mean, I have to ask, who would like a target of 10k now? Anyone remember the No Way to 10k campaign? But this isn't a choice at all. The rules have been set and changed and changed and changed many more times by this government. The government-appointed inspector isn't local, isn't accountable to local people, and this council hasn't chosen where building will take place. We've simply invited mostly private landowners to come forward and tell us where they'd like to make their money. We've spent ages working out how many homes that Welwyn Hatfield needs, how many social homes for rent, and then ignored those strategic figures completely, because if we don't own the land, of course, we have no say on what gets built. We're told clearly that if we don't satisfy this unaccountable inspector, we'll face penalties, real penalties, so much for a local choice. And therein lies the folly of doing it this way, setting up local councils against each other, dumping this huge amount of work on local councils who have already had our resources cut in half at the same time. This is a huge issue. Where are the MPs discussing this? Not here. Clean hands, easy to blame councillors, none of whom here think it's a good idea. But it needs to be said, this hasn't happened overnight. We've come a long, long way from the days where towns and garden cities were planned, where the land itself wasn't such a commodity for the wealthy companies, and people, the public, have chosen every step of the way who have changed that. It's difficult to blame those who repeatedly get re-elected for doing what they always said they'd do. But let's be clear, it might be easy, but it's grotesquely unfair to blame local councillors or local council staff for this. What's the best choice? A local plan that doesn't meet the needs of the future, or a choice that abdicates control with an even worse impact on local people? But that's no choice at all. I doubt this will be reported accurately, as it's never really been since the start. But the only response to this charade is to call it out for what it is and refuse to play the game. Thank you, Chair.
Sonny?
I defer to Councillor Cowan, please.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. The first thing to remember, of course, is that if we did want to meet our OAN, we would not be able to take any sites out of the plan, because the number that's in the recommendation from officers is marginally, very marginally, just below that number. So everything we take out is a risk, but sometimes risks have to be taken. One of the things that has come out very recently is that sustainability apparently rates higher than Greenbelt harm. And as has been said, Simons Hyde is about the most unsustainable site you could have. I just find it mind-boggling that it ever made it into the plan, and I'll be certainly against that. But Birchall Garden Suburb isn't much better. Yes, it's on the edge of the town, but you've got to sort of go out in the countryside to get to it. It's right by a high-speed main road with congestion, noise, and all the rest of it. So I think there are other sites that need to be looked at, and we'll be presenting something a little bit later. So I appreciate the thought that's gone into this, and certainly some of the conclusions we would agree with, particularly over Hat 1. I think you've analysed it and come up with the right conclusion on that particular one. But as has just been said, almost all the ones you're taking out are in the villages, and nothing's been taken out of the towns. And that doesn't seem fair. There seems to be this constant view that, oh, we can get all the houses we want in the towns, and the village is an optional extra on top. So as it stands at the moment, I can't support this. I think we need to go through site by site and decide which ones we can agree with, and do it that way. I don't think voting for a block with potentially about 20 changes is something that I can go along with.
Glenn, you want to quickly come back?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, if there's another proposal, I think rather than beating this one to death, which I, at the minute, just can't agree with, maybe could we see the other proposals side by side? Is that possible, Chair?
Malcolm, where is your proposal? Do you have
Similar information, 4 hours, probably not as big a commentary as was provided for the Conservative proposal, but I believe you've got at least a list, if not a map, to go with it. So with the Chairman's permission, maybe that can be presented.
Sure, but
see what that leads to.
We can do that, but Pangit, do you want to come in first?
Thank you, Chair. Just got a question for officers, actually. I just want to find out how they arrived with this number, 14,206. I just add these numbers, and to me, it works out to be 14,116. So to me, it's again a shortfall of 90 dwellings. So I just want to, if you can just clarify to me how these numbers have been arrived.
Okay, while Sue is doing that, Collins, you want to present the Lib Dems plan? It's a lovely picture, I must say.
All right, thank you. As with the Conservatives, I've been talking to Lib Dem councillors, and this is a proposal they have put forward to me. So Liberal Democrat councillors are concerned about the impact of development on the Greenbelt. They believe there's a balance to be struck between meeting housing needs and protecting the Greenbelt. For those reasons, they propose to remove the extra 75 homes at WGC4 Panzanger to protect the Greenbelt and to retain the area as a green corridor and open space for residents. They propose to remove WGC5 Birchall Garden suburb to protect the Greenbelt, and also because they believe it's an unsustainable and poorly connected to the town, leads to outward sprawl, narrows the gap between Welwyn Garden City and Hertford, and there's also likely to be costly contamination remediation. They propose to remove HAT 15 Simonside to protect the Greenbelt, and also because it's unsustainable, impacts on the natural environment of the area, and has cumulative effects on the road network, plus the other comments they've just made. They propose to remove HAT 11 at Southway and Hatfield to protect the Greenbelt, and because it would be a very visually prominent site, cause coalescence of Hatfield and Welham Green, and results in a much weaker Greenbelt boundary in that location. They consider that WEG3A, WEG15 and WEG10 in Welham Green have cumulative harm on the west side of the village and result in a disproportionate increase in the size of the village. WEG6 to the south also causes coalescence with Brookman's Park. They propose that WEG10 should be reduced from 120 to 60 homes, and a new primary school should be provided on this site on the half of the land rather than WEG17, which is high harm category. They consider that PEA 106 in Welwyn Garden City is an employment site with a viable business in operation and therefore not available to help meet housing needs. They're also concerned by the current planning application for 7 stories on this site and believe that a master plan should be prepared for that area to make sense of the chessboard mix of employment, land and housing schemes coming forward. The councillors recognise that we prepared a sports strategy, and they share the same view in respect of Gosling Sports Park, that this could be reduced from 250 to 100, while a master plan is prepared to identify what might be possible. Similarly, they don't support any increased assumptions for the Weekwater site at the moment, and they don't support any additional homes on BP1. And as you can see, that hopefully results in a number of 12,669 homes for the same period. Thank you.
Thank you. Sonny?
Thank you. There's a couple of points. We went back with 12,000. They said no. We've increased it by 669. He's going to reject that. That's just plain. And that's even more risk. And we are talking about that. I think we might as well just decide to send the old plan back. Just increasing by 669 is just neither here nor there. That's my personal view. It's an interesting point Councillor Cowan made about discussing site by site, but is that really we're going to do that tonight? In effect, it'll end up being a stitch-up. We're the minority, the opposition is the majority, you're just going to vote in the sites that you want in the villages and elsewhere. And I don't want to go into that village by village. We had that last time, and I was accused of, being NIMBY, not having something in my backyard, but, there was reasons for all of these things. And I would like to remind you that this is a consultation that we're going to send back to the council, to cabinet, and at full council this will be debated. As I recall, every full council I have sat on, the opposition's amendments have all gone through. You have a chance at the full council to reject all of this. We're not proposing that this go forward as a plan. We're proposing as something that we send back to cabinet, which has then gone through consultation. Heaven before we have a May election, which I'm sure that's already going to be, there's already literature out there I've seen talking about this, and we're months away from it. This can all, the people can vote the way they want, and the makeup of the council, you can then go ahead and do as you please. We have the Conservative Party is a minority, has not won anything in full council this year. The opposition won everything. You have the upper hand. All we're asking is something to go to cabinet for consultation. Nothing more than that. And who knows, something could be added or taken away. But saying that we're rejected 12,000 and we're going back with 669 more, that's fine. I mean, you want to say that, but not only is he going to laugh about it, he's almost certainly going to go, yeah, you guys can't make a decision, off it goes. A compromise, maybe not the 16,000, but a bit less. We've set 14,000. Let's hear some more proposals, something we can come out of this in a sensible manner. But I'm afraid this is not there.
Glenn?
Thank you, Chair. On the whole, one could say that it sounds reasonable and, away we go. But 12,669 homes is way too short of the mark. That's a new plan. There's no way of looking at that. That is a new plan. The inspector, I honestly think the inspector will throw that out, and then we'll be dragged back through the process of having to create a new plan, which is just going to cost us more and more money and more time, which is kind of against what you said last week, Malcolm. Last week, for anyone who wasn't in the room last week in this enthralling meeting, we heard that St Albans Council are setting aside £1 million a year just to fight appeals. And I think we've got to be reasonable in this council. In some respects, one could say we have, a fair amount of money to sort of in the bank. But I think if we turn around to them and say, by the way, we need to find an extra £1 million a year, that's going to hit the residents really hard. We can't just borrow money for the sake of borrowing money. We have to actually do something serious to find £1 million a year from somewhere. So this particular budget is budget. That's next week. That's next week. And please come to the budget meeting. It's just as thrilling. Yeah, I think Malcolm, the Lib Dem group, you're way short of the mark there. There needs to be some movement. I do like the fact that Simon's Hyde isn't in there. Simonside is a real sticking point for me, I have to admit. But at the moment, I cannot see how that won't just get kicked out. It's dangerous, I think, at this stage of the game, and irresponsible perhaps for us to even consider putting that forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Glenn. Just some points before I give it to Jane. Yeah, Glenn, you very, very responsibly mentioned what was mentioned last week about St Albans Council setting aside £1 million, which is the type of money that most local authorities would struggle to put aside for something like this. Just to echo what Sonny said earlier, of course, this is a plan that we're putting forward for consultation, and it is not the final plan. We have to consider what the inspector would do if this plan in this form was submitted to him. And ultimately, what we are looking for is a plan that we can give to Cabinet tomorrow. Of course, none of us sit on Cabinet, so it is not within our gift to comment on what they would do post this meeting. So I think we should all have that at the back of our minds as we seek to find a solution. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to comment on the Conservative plan. There is some logic behind it in removing the moderate high harm, but if you're going to do that, you should be removing the moderate high harm from all the sites. Otherwise, I do not see where the consistency lies in that approach. We are all of us here trying to second guess what the inspector is thinking. But he has said in the past that, excuse me, we should consider the harm to the green belt, and if the harm is too high, then we should consider what we can build that is sustainable. It doesn't mean that we have to get to 16,000 no matter what. We have to consider the sites, and we have to consider whether they are sustainable, whether their place in the green belt is right. And I think that's what we have been trying to do, is to consider whether those sites that we have concerns with are should be allocated as sustainable sites to be taken out of the green belt. We don't think they should be, because it will do too much harm to the green belt and too much harm to the sustainability of the communities that will go there.
Alan.
Thanks, Chair. I think we've all got to take responsibility of where these homes have to be built. Now, the majority of us are of a certain age where we've got older children or grandchildren going to come along. Now, this is the next 16 years. What's going to happen after that? We are looking at the next generation that want to live here. Now, somebody came up about air quality. If we put any more in the towns, are we going to be walking around like in China where we have to wear masks because of the air quality? Now, I do believe, I have worked Northall, Cuffley, Brookman's Park, Welham Green and everywhere like that, and it has grown. There used to be one house in Welham Green called Welham Manor. But there's a big housing estate on that. In 1980-81, they demolished 116 houses and put 314 there. So the town is taking its fair share, but I think we've got to be responsible for future generations, and the villages have got to take account of the size they are. Because yes, we've got Greenbelt, but as I say, everybody here should think again of where we can put these places. Thank you.
Sonny.
Thank you. Quick point. I think we discussed taking all moderate to high arm out, and I think we came to 10,000, which, well, if 12,000 enough, 10,000 something won't be. I'm keen to move this on. As I predicted, we're never going to agree. So my proposal, if I can get a seconder, and this is not breaking some committee rule or something I don't know about, is the Conservative plan, and as I sit behind a cabinet member who might shoot me, remove Simonside. How many houses do we have then, and can we vote on it?
The proposal up on screen at the moment for 14,206 homes minus 1,130 at Simonside is 13,076 by my reckoning.
Sue, have you managed to check where the variance was?
Sorry, I did check the figures with the calculator. I made the numbers the same, 14,206. So I have been through them all quite carefully. The 160 is additional. So some of those figures are additional and some are taken away. So it may be that you've subtracted one or where one should be added.
Okay, so just to be clear, the response from Sunny to Jane was that last week we asked if moderate high harm and high harm were taken out, what would the figure be? Colin mentioned that would be just over 10,000, which was about 2,000 less than the original plan that was rejected by the inspector. Okay, Glenn.
Thank you, Chair. I like the fact that you're considering taking Simonside out. Now we're moving in the right direction. Okay, so 13,076. Is there any... I don't particularly like the fact that a lot of the sites have come completely out of the villages. I did say that before, and I understand the reasons why. Can we move any of them into Windfall, possibly, or are we sort of maxed out on that one, please, Chair?
Sorry, before you answer that, correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn. So taking out Simonside would mean dropping down all the way to 1,300. No, sorry, 13,076, which is obviously a bit of a distance from where the inspector wants us to be. So you're trying to see if there are ways that we could improve on that figure. Okay, Colin.
We've done through the HELA what we believe is a robust assessment of Windfall. That's because it's an easy thing for the inspector to look at and developers to challenge if you make that number too high without the evidence to back it up. And you're making some projections about the future, inevitably, about what might come forward based upon past trends. The past trends have been relatively high because we don't have a recent plans, and most things being developed are urban sites at the moment. With Greenbelt sites coming forward, whatever they may be, you would expect those to be delivered in accordance with the plan, and other sites may not come forward at the same pace. If you went forward with this plan but assumed a higher Windfall assumption, you would have to presume they're urban sites unless those of you on Development Management Committee would ever contemplate granting permission for Greenbelt sites that weren't in the plan, perhaps because we weren't managing to keep a 5-year housing land supply, perhaps because of other exceptional circumstances, very special circumstances presented to you by the applicant, identified by officers, etc. So I'm not sure it would be that easy to chuck in a number unless you felt there were particular sites that might yield that number. We talked about NOR1, for example. You might feel there are a selection of brownfield sites in Greenbelt locations where, if the right planning application came along, you could foresee granting it permission.
You want to come back, Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So now we're almost back to picking individual sites again. When we did that back in 2016, 2015. I think we've got to lift the number if we can somewhere. I would be minded to go with a officer recommendation on that one, as to what sites they are. Otherwise, we are literally, you're talking to us councillors now to picking out of a haystack, and I don't particularly like necessarily picking out of a haystack when it comes to things like that.
I think you've obviously got the categories up there in that option. In theory, if you chose to change the Conservative view on any of those categories, what this planning reason scenario does, as I see it, is follow a consistent process of judging high harm sites to be too much, judging new moderate high sites to be too much. In theory, if you felt you could change your view on any of those whilst following that consistent process, then that would bring back into your proposal the number associated with that category. The only other option you have available is to contemplate higher densities on sites. Perhaps you feel some of the strategic sites could accommodate more housing, or some of the other sites that remain once this option is enacted, or it would have to be the selection of particular sites that at the moment you're not minded by because they fall into one of these categories on the screen in front of you. I don't know that, you know, our recommendation was what was presented last week. I don't feel comfortable that I can go through your response to option and tell you which sites should go back in.
Thank you, Colin. It's now 5 to 9. I think that is a good moment for us to have a comfort break. It will be 15 minutes long, so can members be back at their seats by 9:10? Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. So, before the break, Glenn had requested that the officers look at areas where they could potentially find some windfall and or other areas to develop in order for our total figure to be higher than the current proposed figure without Simon, well, the Conservative proposed figures minus Simon's side. So, Colin, have you found anything?
Right, I'll run through a list. I'm not necessarily recommending you want to think about all of these. As I explained last week, we've had very early pre-application discussions with the owners of the Wheat Quarter, and they are keen to increase the number of homes on that site. I mentioned numbers of 700 to 900 extra homes. That would necessitate much taller buildings. We haven't done any work on that, but you may feel that an additional increase might be reasonable to assume extra heights on some of those buildings. At the moment, they're an average of 6, 7, 8 stories from memory, and the query is whether they could go anywhere between 10 and 13 stories. You might want to make an assumption for that. That doesn't determine that that site would be suitable for those number of units. They would still have to go through the full planning application process, transport, heritage, visual impact, etc. But it may indicate a greater willingness to do so. But it is a very sustainable site in the heart of a town next to a railway station and a town centre and a bus station. And it's quite possible that the future applicant will pursue that regardless of our mood for it, and that depends on the mood of a planning inspector if it got to appeal. So there is an opportunity there. As I explained earlier, PB1 was in the order to 160 to 200 dwellings, so you might like to up that assumption to nearer 200. Gosling is currently proposed in the submitted plan for 250 homes. I think you've all acknowledged there's a sports strategy and the intent to do a master plan. You might like to assume a higher number there. We'd suggested, it'd been suggested in some of the options you put forward 100. You might want to go up to 150. In terms of things like Nor 1 and others, there are brownfield sites in our green belt. You may feel more in the mood that some of those perhaps come forward, even though the land remains in the green belt, where they demonstrate that they can come forward in the green belt without harming openness and other factors that are important green belt considerations. That could therefore be a windfall assumption. The planning white paper is due very soon. It talks loosely about things like more priority for developments around railway stations and other sustainable transport locations. It's quite likely to introduce new permitted development rights of some sort. Don't know precisely when that's out, but you might like to make some assumptions around that for the period of consultation. We can bring a paper to you on the planning white paper when it's published, setting out what it says, and that might inform your final decisions after consultation when you have that knowledge. Our current windfall assumption is historically it's been about 173 per year from windfall categories. We have assumed 100 going forward. You can't make any windfall assumptions in the first 2 years, but you can for the remaining 13. So if you went back up to 173 rather than 100 or something in between, assuming an extra 73 a year from windfall over 13 years would be an extra 949 assumed there. Or the proposers of Birchill and Hat 1 both proposed to us they could accommodate an extra 200 units on their sites. Our recommendations to you were an extra 100 on each, but you could consider higher densities on those sites if you wished. That's all I've been able to think of in 5 minutes, but I'll let you debate.
Yes, I think that deserves a round of applause. Not from everybody on the panel, clearly. Rebecca Lass.
Thank you, Chair. Before we went for a break, I just wanted to actually second the proposal that was made by my colleague, Sunny. The proposal was to put our new plan forward by taking out of Simonside. And then on the point of windfall, I think PB1, I think definitely should be up to the 200, if not more. And the original application, the calculations, it could have had a couple of thousand homes. I think you mentioned earlier that you were going to have further conversations with the county council on this site. So I would push for those, for even more houses to be put on that site. And then also Nor 1 as a potential site for increased housing. Thank you.
Malcolm?
Yeah, I'm not clear whether Colin's suggestions are going to be formally recorded in the minutes as part of the working up the numbers, or they're just ideas. I mean, it does seem to me that there's some awful pigs in the poke being put forward here. Week quarter, we haven't even got an application. We know that the new school is already going to be full, and that's 3-form entry. So every extra home is going to result in a problem of education places, quite apart from height, quite apart from lack of parking, quite apart from historic buildings. So I think it's awful that we're doing something that might seed an application at this stage. The same was my argument in terms of PA 106. That what's in the plan is a direct copy of the planning application, which is to take away manufacturing from an employment area, which seems to be completely against policy, and it's to accept 7 stories. You know, if we put it in as is, the planning application's decided before it even arrives in front of DMC, and that's really not what we ought to be doing. Development around railway stations, yes. We had a site, west of Brookman's Park, and suddenly that may disappear. I mean, when we had a meeting of members with Colin 6 months ago, whatever, and that site came up, I thought everybody in the room thought it was a good site because it is right on top of the railway station. Go about 200 yards, you're into the shoppings, into the shops, the restaurants, the pub, the school. You know, it's about as sustainable as you'd get in a village. And yet, on the one hand, you want to take it out. On the other hand, it might come back in through this white paper. It's a bit like the hokey cokey. Some of the sites, PB1, I mean, yes, it'd be great if we can put stuff west of Potter's Bar, but I've never been there. I don't know what the place looks like. Clearly, there were arguments against it at the time. Otherwise, it would have turned up because it looked like manna from heaven when that site first came up. And I do have problems over Birchall Garden suburb. Now, were we to say there ought to be a proper investigation and report into getting a proper public transport system there, because it's so remote, if we could say that we were going to put up a proper noise screen, keep out the pollution and all the rest of it, we might have our arms twisted to drop that one from our proposals. And if you did that, with the change at Gosling, that would bring us over 14,000 without adding any of these speculative suggestions, some of which I'm sure are extremely sound, but some of which I have some doubts with. So we would achieve a higher number than the Conservative proposal, provided we were prepared to do something serious about making Birchall Garden suburb more sustainable and a better environment than it is now. There would still be problems about the contamination of the land. That's in the lap of the gods. We can't say who's right of the various people who've investigated it, but you know, if we did something sensible in terms of Birchall, we could come to 14,000 on our proposals. It would save the employment land in Welwyn Garden City, and it would maintain a proper boundary at the south end of Hatfield rather than coming up with this wiggly line. So I throw that into the pot.
Thank you. So, Sonny, essentially we have a proposer and a seconder. Would you like to change what you've proposed based on what you've heard from Colin at all?
The original proposal I made was our plan minus Simonside, and I still say this is a consultation. The reason I didn't clap Colin for his tremendous effort, that I roughly made the windfall at 940 odd, which brings us close to the 14,000. I know that there's an element of vagueness, as mentioned by Councillor Cowan, but even his suggestion, he suddenly found 2,000 from his plan. I fear we go round and round, as I mentioned at the beginning. None of us are going to agree. Let's have a vote. Let's see where we are and go from there.
And just to confirm, do we have a seconder?
I would like to second. Thank you.
Glenn, do you want to say something before we go to this vote?
Thank you, Chair. So, I commend you doing that in like 5 minutes, Colin. That was rapid work. If we had, if we assumed the PB1 and NOR1 with our current windfall, what would the numbers be minus the Simonside on the Conservative proposal?
Right, if you assume the proposal on the screen less Simonside takes us down to 13,076. If you then added in an extra 40 at PB1, that's easy maths, but nevertheless, 13,116. If you then made an assumption that something like NOR 1 could come forward, i.e. a redevelopment of a generally brownfield site in the Greenbelt, and that's a generic assumption that some sites of that nature will come forward over the plan period, you could put in a discrete number for that. In theory, the NOR 1 site, we haven't tested it, so I'm speaking loosely here, maybe 100 units on the land of that area, plus the bit between the settlement and the actual NOR 1 site. So that would be an extra 100 there, for example, going into the windfall number, so 13,216, ignoring all the other options that we talked about.
Glenn?
Thank you, Chair. All right, so ultimately we are going round and round in circles. We've got two now very similar plans. We've got no idea. People might be wondering, where was the Labour plan? Well, to be quite honest, the whole local plan, when it first started, was a blob around Hatfield, as I said last week, and a blob around Welwyn Garden City. That was where we started from. We argued and argued over the years to get more inclusion into the villages. There was more inclusion. Now it seems that a lot of the villages could well be taken back out. There's not enough social housing going into it. This isn't a local plan for local people. The whole local plan system is flawed, fundamentally flawed. And right now, us as the Labour group can't take this any further forward. We'll abstain from any votes.
Okay, so just to be clear, we are now going to go to a vote. Sunny has proposed that we amend the plan. Yes?
In view of the fact that Labour asked, the reason we took out Simonside was to help with the Labour situation. And now they want to abstain it. I'm left in a sort of a bit of a conundrum here, because I was hoping they would vote for it. If they're going to abstain and we go back to with Simonside in, will they continue to abstain, or will they then not vote against it? In which case, we go back to the proposal, which was the Conservative plan minus Simonside.
Okay. And just to be clear, do you want to add the windfall, the 949?
And look after the cabinet, remind me of my voice is loud.
No, you need to be
Sunny.
recorded.
Yep.
Okay. Minding it, this is still a consultation. Our proposal to go back to the cabinet with our proposal minus Simonside plus look at windfall.
Okay. Which will take us to how many homes, just to be clear, Colin? With the 949, sorry.
The historic windfall rate has been 173 per year, and we've assumed for the future 100 per year. If you up that back to 173 a year for 13 years, because you can't do it for the first 2 years, that is an extra 949 homes assumed in the windfall, which at the moment is 1,304, which takes that to 14,025. So you would have 14,206 minus 1,130 removed from Simon's side, plus 949 extra in the windfall category, takes you to 14,025 would be the consultation number.
Sonny?
It's still a risk, but it's a risk I'm willing to take to move this conversation forward.
Okay, so we're now going to go to a vote. Sonny has proposed, Rebecca has accepted. I'm joking. Sonny has proposed, and Rebecca has seconded. All in favour of this proposal, please. In fact, sorry, we can use the electronic voting. So, yes, we can. Do I have to press the button?
Yeah, you need to vote as well. So you've got a little scripty thing there.
Do I have to read this?
No, so you need to.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so the proposal has passed. Yep. 5, 4, 3 have abstained and 3 have disagreed. Okay. That's it. This meeting is now closed. Thank you all for coming. No, that's it. Definitely closed. There's nothing else.